Okay, welcome everybody to the State Library of New South Wales and our lecture tonight from Professor Mark Ledbury, What Price the Humanities? Now, before we begin, I would like to ask Uncle Alan Madden to give the welcome to country.
Thank you. Once again, my name is Alan Madden, Gadigal Elder. For my first song, nah, only kidding. Married man, 10 children, 26 grandchildren, 10 great-grandchildren. Yes, we did have TV. Just couldn't afford the bloody electricity. Where we are today is Gadigal. Gadigal is one of 29 clans of the Eora Nation. But first and foremost, I'd like to acknowledge our Aboriginal elders, all elders, past and present, and pay my respects. And to all our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters, from whatever Aboriginal or Island nation you may have come from, welcome to Gadigal. And to all our non-Indigenous brothers and sisters, a very warm and sincere welcome to you to Gadigal. No matter where you've come from, whether it be across the seas, across the state, or across town, once again, a very warm and sincere welcome to you to Gadigal. And as I've mentioned many times before, was, is, and always will be Aboriginal land. Only three things shorter than that: coming, taxation, and going. As I mentioned, where we are today is Gadigal. Gadigal is one of 29 clans of the Eora Nation. The Eora Nation is bounded by nature's own, the Hawkesbury River to the north, Nepean to the west, and Georges River to the south. And in between those three mighty rivers is the Eora Nation. And in that nation, there are 29 clans. And the clan's land we're on this evening is Gadigal. On behalf of members of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council and of the Gadigal mob, welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you.
So thank you, Uncle Alan, and that impressive recount of your family history. 10 children, 3's enough, goodness gracious. Welcome, my name is Richard Neville and I am the Mitchell Librarian and Director of Engagement here at the State Library of New South Wales, and I'd like to reiterate and acknowledge that we are on Gadigal land. In fact, the Mitchell Library is built out of Gadigal land, it's built out of Maroubra sandstone. So this is the first time that the State Library has hosted the Australian Consortium of Humanities Research Centres for this important annual event, and it's this lecture is always a highlight of the ACHRC. I think you should get an easier acronym to say, calendar. And so this year I'm very pleased to introduce the guest lecturer, Professor Mark Ledbury. Mark took his degrees at the University of Cambridge and the University of Sussex. He has engaged deeply with art throughout his career, which includes his work at the University of Portsmouth, Universities of Manchester and the Sterling and Francine Clark Institute in Massachusetts. And he's, of course, the director of the Power Institute, which is my old alumni, where he is focused on the Institute's mission of public engagement through talks, conferences and the support of research and publications. Tonight, Mark is asking a very provocative and I think very timely question in terms of the way many humanities academics feel they are travelling, and one which I think we've all been asking this year: what price the humanities? Now, if in the course of this lecture you feel you have a question for Mark, just please use the chat feature in Zoom, and I'll be back at the end of this to facilitate some questions. But for now, please welcome Mark.
Thank you very much, Richard. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming digitally or in person. I'm now, as I am when I work at the university on Gadigal land. I thank Uncle Alan for his welcome. I'm honoured to be welcomed, and I pay my respects to myself, to the long tradition of custodianship of country and culture of the traditional owners, and pay my respects to your elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to thank the ACHRC and especially Will Christie and Rachel Franks for everything she's done, and everyone at the State Library of New South Wales, a marvellous institution which is as welcoming and energetic in COVID as I note, as it always is in normal times. So I'm going to start with a disclaimer. This is a humanities and conference, an excellent theme. The theme of the 2 days is going to make much of the necessary and fundamental connections between humanities research and that in the sciences and more broadly in the medical sciences. Couldn't agree more. I love and respect science, actively collaborate with my science colleagues, and don't want anyone to think that I tonight or anyone else here is replaying some two cultures argument. My laments, such as they may be, that the humanities are economically and culturally undervalued is not an argument against the value economically or culturally of the sciences or technological knowledge. But of course, I'm a professional in a humanities discipline. I'm speaking about why humanities matter, and to that extent, there may occasionally be a comparison, invidious or perhaps jealous, with science funding. This is not a plea for lower science funding, but for proper consideration of the value of humanities to our economy as well as to our society. So I was going to start with a true monathon, I suppose, and go through the grim stats of our relative fairings in the ARC's recent rounds. This is actually last year's round. This year's looks even worse, but they haven't published it yet. The slice of the pie, as we know, according to humanities research in Australia, is rather small. I think I can say that without exaggeration. I think we can also say that this has structural origins in the lack of a separate and distinct funding stream for humanities in Australia, no equivalent of the Canadian SSHRC, the UK's AHRC, now part of UK Research and Innovation, or in Germany, whose DFG, I think, is a more meaningful and aspirational comparator because it harnesses national, federal, state funding in various ways. And I may just leave you to read this and weep, noting the humanities and social sciences 492.9 million euro annual funding, and indeed funding of 251.6 million euros for no subject classification. In other words, for that kind of experimental research in the humanities, and which will occupy us over the next few days. But I think we're clearly in need of a certain kind of rethink, but that rethink must be preceded by an actual realization of the value in social, cultural, but also economic terms of actually spending money on humanities research. And whether we like it or not, funding models, as well as individual funding decisions within models, are a structural sign of a lack of belief in the value of investment in the social sciences and humanities research. So, you know, and I feel there are sort of knock-on effects of this, because once you do have dedicated research facilities, you can, of course, create lots of what these days are called self-reinforcing positive feedback loops, I suppose, engagement programs, opportunities to publicize and engage with the public on humanities research. Think of this excellent program, the New Generation Thinkers program, that gets a very successful collaboration with major broadcasters. I know that there are embryonic versions of this in Australia, but this is a thoroughgoing and extensive program. And I have to say, in Germany, it's even better. Imagine the ARC t-shirt. I've chosen knowledge. Ich habe mich für das Wissen entschieden. That's I'm waiting for the ARC version of this. And indeed, the RV that will take the ARC around and promote the importance of fundamental research all around Australia, as this German bus does. But I'm afraid I'm going to switch from this rather nice picture of what might happen in Germany to one of the more grim Twitter storms of the last few months. And I don't know if any of you have been following this, but this is the so-called, inverted commas, Fatima poster. This was created by and published and soon unpublished by the UK government. And indeed, it was unpublished because of the many memes that it gave rise to. Before we get all bash the poms about it, though, it lives in a long line of extremely tin-eared poster campaigns, including these two that I particularly love from Australian campaigns of one kind or another. But this poster had a particular valence for those of us working in the arts and humanities, partly because it did indeed spur some fantastic internet creativity. This, of course, is Dominic Cummings, as you know, the notoriously short-sighted advisor to Boris Johnson. But one of the more interesting reactions was this one, which was a sort of attempt to fight back by the creative communities who saw this very coercive poster as sort of, they saw the ironies and the hypocrisies of a poster so needing creative input, being told, sort of instructing people that maybe the creative life was over and one should get into something called cyber, which I'll come. But those of us who are into sort of visual culture smelt something even fishier, more disturbing. We wondered, who cropped this photograph? Who invented it, and for what? The illuminating answer lay in the work of a photographer called Chris Alex from Atlanta, Georgia, who took a photograph of Desiree, and we can't use the young person's full name, an aspirant ballet dancer, with her instructor and studio owner, Tasha Williams, the elder of the two ladies in the picture. An instructor who, as Chris Alex said, had dedicated her life to helping aspirant dancers, those from less wealthy demographics of Georgia, it must be said, to go on to college and to study ballet and dance to fulfill careers. Alex's photograph she shared generously on various photographic commons. It ended up on a stock photo site from where it was pilfered and cropped, used free and unacknowledged, with scant attention to the multiple and complex issues of appropriation involved in such a move, as part of a multi-poster campaign by the British government. But Chris Alex's photograph has a visual history too. By the way, this is it in its context of Tasha Williams's Vibes in Motion dance studio. But this photo, of course, has a visual history. It recalls inevitably Degas' now iconic and much discussed paintings of dancers in preparation, such as Before the Ballet in the Met, but it responds to that violence and distortion in Degas with a determined cross-generational feminist image of perfect balance and mirroring. Before I get all art historical, though, my main point is that this poster, this campaign is not just guilty of theft, but of assault. It severs the teacher from the student. It removes the evidence of the effort, skill, and engagement, the mentorship of that teacher. It severs the pupil from the learning community and space and from her sight, leaving Fatima, who's actually called Desiree, the student, bereft and alone, to be renamed and repurposed. Indeed, and that hackneyed repetition plays ironically not just with the rule of three, of course, but with reduce, reuse, recycle, and other sloganizing, even from whence comes, I think, even the sinister cyber first entity. And of course, those who study the evolution of words, the linguists among you, will be weighing that neo-noun cyber as a strange utopian imaginative concept, a site of endless potential, but also a dystopia for many. The message is not hopeful, but brutal and coercive, pointing to the idea that we need to retrain generations to do proper jobs or future-oriented jobs that we've heard a lot in Australia about, as universities have had to adjust very quickly to one of the shoddiest, I have to say, rhetorical justifications of legislation I can ever remember, the Jobs Ready Graduates Bill, whose rhetoric paralleled this clumsy and coercive campaign in so many ways. The poster's violence, done to creative people, yes, is also done to the origins, energies, and struggles that gave it visual form. And it's notable for its acts of severing, forgetting, and unbonding. it implies that it's time to move on to more value-adding careers. If the humanities community is likewise severed, undervalued and marginalized, it will be, I think, similarly vulnerable. There's a lot at stake. Now, this is not news to most of us in the humanities community, but our response has sometimes been a mixture of acute critique, of the value systems involved. We're here not to produce value, we're here to expose, sorry to quote Monty Python, but the violence inherent in the system. And sometimes stoic quietism, insistence on our inestimable value, that society, culture, thought, our justice system are unthinkable without humanities research, of course. And I think I've taken this high road in the past, resisting instrumentalization, quantification of research, and beginning almost to value the image of the humanities as heroically underfunded, as a truth teller who doesn't need a grant. Pursuing what our departing Vice Chancellor, Michael Spence, recently wistfully called the unrelenting pursuit of the true, the good and the beautiful, with or without the money to do so. But I would like here, I think, to sort of think again, to use as a metaphor perhaps, or a comparator or a way forward, the value of the statistical value of a human life. Many have, of course, rhetorically believed and asserted that human life is above the crude process of valuation, and of course that is true. But that hasn't prevented thoughtful, theoretical and statistical values being put on human life in dollars and cents, and that this statistical value becoming a useful, important tool for economists, for policymakers and those who realize that for many purposes, some economic calculation was both necessary and possible. Having models to estimate human life's value enabled risk-based decision-making, the weighing up of societal benefits and versus costs. And we've seen that a great deal in the COVID pandemic. Economists in the audience will be familiar with the work pioneered notably by schools around Kip Viscusi, whose work directly influenced policies decisions in the United States by arguing that risks and cost-benefit analysis should not be informed by simple lifetime loss of wages calculations, but by complex formulae for the value of a statistical life, arrived at through much data mining of actuarial, survey and union data about risk premiums for jobs with high mortality risks via complex formulae, and began to set what he called the value of a statistical life, which at the moment runs at about $10 million in the United States, and according to the Australian government, 4.5 million Australian dollars. I'll leave you to conclude what you'd like. But this has led theoretical and extrapolated, and rather imaginatively extrapolated as it is, to key policy decisions. The Environmental Protection Agency, when questioned, estimated that using such statistical methods developed by Viscusi and co. in 1990, that the Clean Air Act that cost $550 billion could be shown to have created trillions, ranging from 5.9 to a high estimate of $25 trillion of savings in the improvement of human life via statistical understandings of what a human life estimate might be. But okay, so how can we do, let alone imagine, the complex maths and stats required to begin to calculate the value of the humanities, the statistical or theoretical value of the humanities? That's my task. And of course, I'm not the first to think this, and indeed a recent and very convincing survey commissioned by Macquarie University from Deloitte Access Economics, which I'm sure many of you will know, the value of the humanities, commissioned by them, and which is freely available for all to consult, has made a great start in trying to quantify, for example, the value added of a degree versus not taking one in the humanities, and soft skills, and those kind of ways of getting at what it is that humanities provide. But I think we need to go further, to use our own skills as humanities researchers and thinkers, and in imaginative and I think slightly more lateral thinking ways, akin to Kip Viscusi's fundamental moves away from the simple wage model, to explore ways in which we might put a statistical value on humanities research. Now, I won't be discussing every possible way, but focusing on some areas in which we might be able to mine and extrapolate the data we need. Okay, firstly, the role that humanities research has in material, cultural, and social restoration. In other words, the transfer of value to rightful owners and those robbed or otherwise despoiled. Then what I'll call the humanities spark effect, an index of the innovation transfer chain that leads from the humanities to significant economic activities in unexpected areas. And thirdly, what we might call the humanities community commons. If I get the chance, or in discussion, we might also go on to the humanities opportunity cost. In other words, what does it cost us not to fund the humanities and instead to choose something not science, but let's say sports clubs in marginal constituencies, just for the sake of argument, the lost opportunities, growth and returns that we don't get from investing in humanities and instead in business as usual. So, restoration. Now, we know there's a direct line between humanities research and what we might call restorative social and economic justice. Now, we know this in many ways, and we know that it has specific and measurable outcomes. In other words, money or land, property, goods are transferred from one ownership to another, and there is a value attached to that. Leaving aside for the moment, and I don't wish to because I think it's going to be the big issue of the next few decades, the wealth of research on slavery's economic and cultural histories, which have fueled a very serious reparations debate in the United States. You may have read this wonderful piece by Ta-Nehisi Coates in The Atlantic, which is based on a wealth of humanities research. And because, in a way, this debate still has much time and has not been resolved. But one project that I think is more mature in some ways that touched me as a grad student was the work of historians such as Serge Klaasfeld and Robert Paxton, who had re-examined French archives relating to Vichy and occupied France, and in doing so, discovered and made comprehensible French involvement in the deportation and mechanics of persecution that had been occluded in many cases. This had profound social and cultural benefit, served a notion of national truth, but it also began a process of wealth and cultural restitution, one that formally acknowledged pain and suffering and financial loss, which is still going on. And in fact, what you may not be able to see so clearly on the screen here over here is a very recent announcement by the French National Institute of the History of Art about their library's holdings of manuscripts and prints and other collections, which they have discovered to have been spoliated, and they are now still in the process of transferring from French families and others. Of course, the benefits of the wider work of post-war restitution of artworks alone has recently been estimated as worth tens of billions of dollars. And while one might not therefore say that all of this is value creation through humanities research, it is part of a framework of justice, reparation and restitution that will be, I think, in Australia as elsewhere, one of the most important economic as well as social phenomena of the 21st century. Without patient, dogged and often brilliant and inspired humanities research, this value transfer, I believe, could not have been realized or measured. Anthropological, archaeological, art historical, legal and philosophical scholarship lies underneath these decisions, these legal decisions in the courts. Perhaps those models and the past transformation of those models into financial change may be a model for how we might go about the much larger tasks in the future. Now, those of you who are much more familiar with this than I will know that anthropology's complex and often difficult role in colonial violence and conquest has been much commented on in research. My colleagues here present and beyond on this Zoom. And of course, today's anthropologists, including many of my colleagues at UCID, are instrumental, refuse the instrumental and are deeply critical, committed to extraordinary levels of self-scrutiny and to deep understandings. But it may not hurt us, I think, to at least think about the way in which, however compromised, however difficult, anthropology also does act and is acting in the present as a value creator for the communities it's increasingly come to listen to and serve, especially when it comes to the difficult but vital work of upholding the values and the value of First Nations community ownership of land. In Australia, but also internationally. This is, of course, a live and complex issue, as Paul Trigger's work and the responses to it has made clear in recent decades. But I found it very instructive recently to read the annual report of the Northern Territory Land Council with the sort of stories it does and doesn't tell on the government's transparency portal. but also the particular discussion of the sometimes troubled but vital work of what they call the anthropology branch, which directly informs policy, settlements, and inclusions for the indigenous peoples of the Northern Territory. Imperfect though this process no doubt is, it's a demonstration, or at least it's a model of direct intervention by skilled people whose skills have been developed through humanities frameworks. And the deep understanding, it's only the deep understanding that the methods and results of anthropological research can and must bring that can engender actual legal, physical, and monetary change. So perhaps we might take, no one wants to instrumentalize the humanities, but we might think, those at least have models which might serve, as Viscusi thought, well, how would we get to the value of human life? Well, we'll look at danger money, we'll look at existing models of what we do. Well, I think we should look at where knowledge has directly translated into financial restitution or gain and try to extrapolate. Okay, so there's also the spark effect. And here, this might seem a little more lighthearted, but I think humanities scholarship is excellent at teasing out the subtle routes, pathways, and networks of ideas and their impact in social, cultural, and intellectual histories. I think, that's sort of a baseline. And I myself have published on innovation transfer in inter-arts communities in Ancien Régime France. But seldom do we mobilize these very skills to argue for a revaluation of what we might call the spark effect, the crucibles of humanities research and scholarship that inspire individuals and groups to create profound economic, entrepreneurial, and financial value in a given culture. So I'm talking about the institutions, classes, networks, and groupings across the history of scholarship in the human sciences, that wealth of teaching, research, and mentorship, peer enthusiasm that molds and forms individual figures and institutions. Figures whose impact and economic consequences on a society or worldwide is considerable will openly and avowedly owe a debt to the kinds of humanities and social sciences education that formed them. But like the cyber campaign, our accounts have often severed such figures and their wealth creation from the formative and inspirational structures that shape them. To read, an Australian example, to read the remarkable, strange but remarkable thesis of the Australian economist Richard Charles Mills, The Colonisation of Australia, the Wakefield Experiment and Empire Building, is to understand just how economic history and the thinking of experimental London baths of humanities and social science experiment, like the early London School of Economics, the specific guidance of Graham Wallas, the great Fabian socialist, social psychologist, and pioneer scholar of human creativity, impacted on a mind, R.C. Mills, that went on to influence, among other things, Australian monetary policy, the federal tax system, and most importantly for our purposes, the system of generous government grants or making places available in higher education, which was fundamental to the first post-war growth of the university system in Australia. And of course, he was chair of the commission that led to the founding of the ANU too. For me, Mills is a product of the new kinds of applied experimental humanities and social sciences at LSE, as much as he is of, say, his distinguished service in the army or the University of Sydney. But how could we measure that specific course setting that early work did in his early years? Or the sort of particular and extraordinary moment of thought development via the human sciences? It's even more difficult to measure this for those who go on to achieve financial success outside institutions, which of course then have annual reports or measurable outputs. We could cite the Rowling dilemma. Perhaps I'll leave that out for the minute, but J.K. Rowling, who's responsible for a staggering amount of not only personal but social and economic wealth creation, as well, I think, as an incalculable cultural contribution, self-confessed bookworm who took French and ancient Greek and Roman studies at Exeter University and whose encounters, she avows, with the strongly humanities-oriented philological degree in French there in the 1980s and ancient Greek study, classical civilization studies might be credited in past, at least, according to her own words, for the creation of that meticulous irreality effect via linguistic and philological illusion, 19th century children's literature, etc. in Harry Potter, a creation and a franchise worth 25 billion US dollars, probably a little more now. What part did this particular aspect of her mind formation play? Critics would say there's just too much noise. We can't find the signal for the noise in that chain. I'm less sure because
I was formed by social historians intent on a skepticism towards individual genius and fond of undermining the claims of, say, the older versions of national technological genius in the Industrial Revolution through accounts stressing the complex web of raw material and empire, dissenting thought, migrant communities that contributed to a vast wealth-creating change in the period. So that's, Maxine Bergs and Robbie Grays and many others. So we might learn lessons from our own research, and in the case of the outstanding creative individual, resist severing them from the network of teachers, mentors, and colleagues, because great cultural and financial edifices are always at some level, perhaps, collective. But of course, most humanities learning and teaching doesn't end up in spectacular franchises generating billion-dollar revenue. But it may not be entirely spurious to make the claim that many of the most lucrative enterprises in the world of contemporary entertainment are built on the stuff of what might be called the humanities network, the web of linked disciplines across psychology and history and philosophy and visual and literary arts and their history that seem to be vital and even measurable catalysts, if not direct inspirations, in the careers of many value-adding creative talents. I mean, this is true in the content teams behind other of the great dominant financial and cultural forces in our current world. Take the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the most lucrative film franchise of our time, which has its roots circuitously in the Roosevelt New Deal. It was particularly the network of WPA Federal Theatre Project that gave Stan Lieber, later Stan Lee, the key creative in the early days of Marvel Comics, the chance to transform himself into a writer and performer. Through his spell in the unlikely humanities network of the Army Signals Division with Frank Capra and Dr. Zeus Geisler, that's also important, but he began the superhero revolution in the 1950s, to quote authoritative sources, by introducing complex characters who could have bad tempers and fits of melancholy and vanity, who bickered among themselves, who, in other words, were drawn from that well of theatre and literature. If we then jump forward, leaving out, of course, a great deal, to the creation of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, a new group of content creators, drawing on Lee and his collaborative networks, this time explicitly fueled the post-war boom in creative, and were more explicitly fueled by the post-war boom in creative and humanities education at US universities and colleges. Kevin Feiger, one of the key producer creatives, who graduated from an institution, from the University of Southern California's motion picture school, an institution whose stress on the history of motion pictures and understanding of the complexity of cinema's past is a key element of its curriculum. It was intent on transforming film scholars into filmmakers. To directors and writers like Joss Whedon, creator of much else, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Firefly, The Avengers, and who was on his own admission deeply influenced, sparked by the humanities-oriented work of the historian and cultural critic Richard Slotkin, famous professor at Wesleyan College, whose exploration of American myths and frontier stories clearly impacted on Whedon. Now, we could easily say these people just networked in Hollywood. It's coincidence. But actually, the catalyst for so many of these and other franchise successes is self-avowedly some kind of bath in humanities thinking. Steve Jobs insisted on the value to the growth of Apple of his having taken, never completed, but taken a famous, very historically driven calligraphy class at Reed College, a major center of calligraphy studies in the United States, both under the great Lloyd Reynolds and Robert Palladino. And that this led directly to the development of fonts that made a creative difference to Apple. To stay with Apple, the decisive effect on Johnny Ive, the man that even more than Jobs gave Apple its new aesthetic and business advantage in the last 15 years, has never been really measured of his mentors at the University of at Newcastle Poly, as was in the 1980s, who put him in contact with the history of the Bauhaus and the Bauhaus-derived design principles of the great Dieter Rams, here beautifully pictured, the ex-Bauhaus guru and Braun chief designer. Or again, Catherine Bigelow, the brilliant director of the Hurt Locker and much else, who was a notable graduate of one of the great humanities experimental networks, the Graduate Film Program at Columbia University. She encountered Vito Acconci, Susan Sontag, Edward Said as teachers and mentors, but also major figures from the world of conceptual art. And I almost forgot, of course, the great cinema course in Melbourne that brought together the former medical student George Miller and Byron Kennedy, and of course gave Australia one of its most economically as well as culturally important film franchises, Mad Max. Horror of horrors even. Game of Thrones, sorry to mention it, but from George R.R. Martin's books to David Benioff and D.B. Weiss, who, remember, met in Trinity College Dublin, where Benioff was writing a thesis on Samuel Beckett and Weiss was writing a thesis on Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. It's almost, you couldn't make it up. But if it's too easy a target to look at the creative moving picture industry or books, we can go further. Leaps and sparks don't just light on the well-prepared ground of the bookworm or film nut. The man responsible, at least in part, for the creation of the franchise PopCap Games was Jason Kapalka, a Canadian. And one of his most famous creations at PopCap was Bookworm, a great favorite in our house. Kapalka had studied for a master's degree in English and film studies at Alberta, where he encountered the courses of one of the great historians of the dictionary and lexicography, John Considine. Now, that's a perhaps too obvious comparison, but you know, one might also, in the world of games, cite the vast franchise of Ubisoft and Assassin's Creed. Perhaps not all of you are gamers, but Patrice Desilets, who earned his degree in film studies and literature at the Université of Montréal, created and deliberately used those knowledges in his, and if any of you have played, this is Unity, my favorite, it's set in the French Revolution. We need then to develop some actual models, something like a sort of initial humanities input assessment to these multi-billion-dollar concerns. As Steve Jobs himself said, you can only connect the dots looking backwards. It's time to use our skills in looking backwards to join the dots that lead from the seemingly unpragmatic, job-unready humanities research hubs to the trillion-dollar companies, billion-dollar franchises, and culture-changing acts of creativity I've been mentioning. I've only sketched a few. But once we do, we can surely do a Kit Viscusi and imaginally extrapolate from areas where invention and creation do attract value, perhaps patents, to estimate the potential and statistical value of the ideas and the research intensives offered by rigorous humanities scholarship and by the engineered innovation transfer and curated serendipity of many outstanding curricula in the humanities. Right, so must come to the end, but I will just mention, I think, the creative commons of the humanities. Now, the sinewy humanities networks I've been discussing, which are flashpoints of creative meanings and technical and conceptual leaps, are part of a wider pool of value creation in humanities for today's world. I've been reminded of this by another muddle-headed piece of recent federal government regulation, the unedifying bullying and counter-bullying fest that is the government's recent news media and digital platforms mandatory bargaining code, demanding $1 billion from internet giants for stolen news content. But as all of you who've ever boiled down your research for a podcast, interview, or think piece in media know, there's never been a satisfactory valuing by these very same media companies of the extraordinary range of philosophical, historical, and cultural and scientific research that gets mangled into news stories daily by major networks, and always has. And we, because of our public service ethos, our drive to engagement, our belief in open dialogue, even our love of a minute or two in the limelight and accrued reputational benefit, have been willing, nay, enthusiastic participants and suppliers. Often across the media spectrum, this humanities commons, and yes, there is clearly and obviously equivalently a science commons, is seen as a found object, something that's turned into polished gems by journalists or podcasters or YouTubers. But actually, when we look closely at the scripts and transcripts, we see that a very significant percentage of this raw material is in fact derived from the result of painstaking, longue durée research by generations of humanities scholars. We have in the humanities championed the availability of research and our findings for a common good, and I would not want to change this. But again, if we are to statistically value this contribution, we need to see it for what it is, a vast and brilliant repository of freely offered and available content creation for, from making available of ancient texts and translation, the unearthing of material records, the display of artwork, the discovery of transformative archival repositories, scholarship on indigenous knowledge systems, and so much else that we present to world culture. This is the fabric with which the visual, textual, and digital tapestry of the current cultural age is being spun. If you don't believe me, take a 20-minute self-directed click survey of the monetizing machines like Instagram or Pinterest. The media platforms we normally attribute with the great transformative power, from Apple Podcast, HBO to Netflix, Google, and Amazon, even the morally dubious but economically monstrous Facebook, is a shell. They're shells. They're holding companies without creative content. So imagine a theoretical scenario in which the humanities commons argued a case equivalent to the one now being pursued against Facebook and Google. Of course, we don't want to do this except theoretically, but why not use the government's own fair model of royalty payable for news content to extrapolate out to humanities commons content. The sums would be enormous. And this is value that we, as continuers of that commons, are generously leaving on the table for the big beasts to feed on for free. But we must, I think, at least make a statistical claim on it. More than this, I'd like to be more, I think I have to wrap up, but I would like to say that it's not just that we inspire people who go on to, to spin new yarns. We have done what Harvard Business Review said Marvel was brilliant at. We have cultivated customer curiosity. We, as the humanities community, have cultivated public curiosity. Great humanities research grabs the attention of a society, performing acts of philosophical daring, ethical fortitude that results in, for example, the other minds phenomenon and new other understandings of animal consciousness, curating exhibitions, which make hundreds of thousands of people see differently. The work of historians, beautifully described a while back in the Griffith Review, who here in Australia, as elsewhere, have deliberately cultivated the historical imagination. And I will leave out the citation, which is rather beautiful. But the skills and vision at the heart of some of the most innovative history of the past decades, here and elsewhere, has surely cultivated and fueled our appetite for engaging, challenging, lucrative, let's be honest, enterprises from Bollywood to manga to Harry Potter to Wolf Hall to The Crown, let alone Game of Thrones and Marvel. It's often our role when we get brought onto programs to criticize the inaccuracies of, say, the BBC's recent horrifying Versailles. But what we should instead be reminding the polity is that without the patient and for centuries-long work of cultivation of the historical imagination and appetite for engagement with the complexities of our many pasts, blockbuster television would have no purchase, no economic and no cultural reach. What's the statistical value of that long-term imaginative groundwork? Okay, so I must wrap up. I can explain in slightly more details how I would like to base this on, coal royalties and other terrifying things. But I think I shall just end here by saying that we shouldn't, I'm not actually aiming that we should claim these expenses like, the CSIRO was recently described as a patent troll for its dogged pursuing of the Wi-Fi patent. But I do think that we get together with colleagues from economics, maths, and statistics, begin again to join up again relevant and important relationships that have been sundered overtly or surreptitiously. We seek lateral thinking jumps like that of the Scusi and colleagues, use a combination of them to enable us to value and prize as well as price our work in the humanities, work out fair cost-benefit equations, and actually bring to the forefront of societal thinking both the values we uphold and the value we create. It's an urgent first step to begin to develop frameworks to fairly value and acknowledge the range of work in our disciplines, so that nationally and at the level of our universities and colleges, our foundations and philanthropies, we might adequately and fairly fund and sustain, develop and improve our research, teaching engagement in our pursuit. Our pursuit of the aim of, I think it's the aim of all of those who are for knowledge, für das Wissen, in all branches of human inquiry. The pursuit of the good, the true, the beautiful, the just, the bold, the new, and the challenging for many generations to come. Thank you. I'm on.
We're both on.
I think you are. Just speak close, Richard. It should be.
Here we go. Is that better? Yeah. Excellent. Okay. So thank you. That was certainly a cry from the heart. The public intellectual seems to have disappeared in a way. I mean, the heroes of the last year have all been the scientists, haven't they? The sort of scientists who've taken control of the narrative. How do the humanities intellectuals find their way back into the marketplace?
Well, I mean, that's an excellent question. I think we have to temper our, I mean, we have had scientific heroes in Australia and across the world this year who deserve to be celebrated, and the astonishing collective efforts of the scientific community, there is no getting away from it. This has been, but despite great odds, knowledge seems to have emerged with a certain amount of new luster. But I would also say
that what has been very interesting through the eruption and the particular new wave of this year's wave of the Black Lives Matter movement is that it is more deeply informed by longer and deeper histories of the situation, the longer, deeper, and more nuanced histories of the situation of communities in the United States, both African American communities and Native American communities, who have, who have found themselves, on the wrong side of a system that has been oppressive and of a violence that has been, flagrant and sometimes frightening. So I think that there have also emerged humanities and public intellectual heroes across the spectrum. In my listening, I don't think they've entirely disappeared. I think that and I think there are they're not in quite the same spaces they used to be. Maybe the podcast is where you're going to find them rather than in the public square in other places. But I'm not entirely without hope that the public role of deep scholarship in the humanities, I mean by that, scholarship that, is informed by generations and traditions of scholarship, bench and project that goes and makes new information, new scholarship, and new theorizing possible. That I think has had a fair run. But I think in some ways there has been, a certain deference this year to the brilliance of the scientific community.
Someone says here, not a question, but a thank you. That was amazing. It is kind of interesting, I suppose, and particularly in an institution like this, and you talk about the Black Lives Matters and the importance of the Indigenous, looking at colonialist archives to put a post-colonial spin and well, not a spin, but a new way of thinking about our past. I suppose one of the questions here, in a way, is if we're trying to look at those kind of advantages, because ultimately you could say that to bring those stories forward will advantage those communities. But in the kind of neoliberal perspective in which we now sit, is that a value that we're going to, how do you argue those kinds of sort of soft core values, which historians say and anthropologists and so on are going to be bringing into the...
Yeah, okay, so I am quite wary of terms like soft skills and soft values. I mean, they sort of belong in certain dualities that one fairly doesn't want to but I think most humanities scholars would recognize. But I do feel that the idea that community value is soft value is a product of some very strange thinking that's been foisted on us. In other words, that there's real the only real value is value that you can get a royalty off, that you can be a rent seeker from. That, to me, is obviously, I think, something that's changing, because I think when I was trying to talk about restorative justice, I think you can monetize community restoration. You can say jobs, positions, funding for institutions, communities is actually, there is a monetary aspect to that. And what that is, I'm afraid to say it if it sounds too radical, but whatever, but it is redistribution. But redistribution is an economic fact. What it says is there are claims to be made on the national and cultural wealth of the nation, and that we must help these claims be made. We must help these rebalances happen.
So here's another, so when the world is going to hell in a handbasket, hopefully it's not, but it seems as if we have a society adopted an unofficial Maslow's hierarchy of needs: curing cancer, finding a vaccine for COVID, solving climate change. They all seem to take priority over art. And so what's the relationship, the question asked, between arts, humanities, and these other needs and priorities? How do you kind of...
I think the next few days will be a really very fascinating discussion of this, and I couldn't possibly speak for the incredible range of talent that's going to speak on that. But I will say this: representation, in the sense of the human desire to represent, to make marks, to understand the visual world around the human, is a fundamental human need, I believe, in the way that eating is a fundamental human need. I'm not sure it's as provably vital, but we have evidence to show that, you know, human societies across the globe made marks, ground pigments, decorated their bodies, and this is not trivial. This is not, I think, those kind of deep anthropological and, you know, let's call them art historical, but they're not really, insights do help us round out a picture of perhaps a less degree zero kind of humanity and a much more importantly rounded nature of human existence. But that, on the other hand, I would say that you know, I think there's a direct relationship between the very brilliant and increasingly thoughtful Indigenous-led scholarship on custodianship, environmental management, those things which have fallen into humanities buckets in some ways, over what we're going to do to manage Australia's next 50 years and how we're going to tackle big questions like health and climate change. So in a way, although I would argue that sort of the visual culture, at least art, is a fundamental human need, I think that the question also already prejudices us against the kind of scholarship that humanities, the contribution that humanities make. And I note on the program of our next few days that we're going to have a lot of thought about that, about humanities and what the humanities sort of give to large-scale conceptions of social and environmental and even well-being change, which we're going to hear a lot about, health, in other words.
Yeah, so maybe just a quick final question here, because it's nearly time to wrap up. But and I think this will probably be another question that's going to be coming through for the next couple of days. If you is there a risk that humanities will be undervalued as a uniquely valuable means for assessing value, I suppose, if you're trying to embrace so funny technocratic and
yeah. Look, yes, I think, but here's my real commitment. I believe that we have to do something because in a way that equivalent to the reassessment of the value of human life that Viscusi and Co did, in order to move the needle of the deep prejudice against the value of what we do. And I think sometimes we might have to get really clever and really economic and really policy driven about it. And I also feel that, you know, Australia is lacking the grand non-governmental injection of humanities philanthropy on the scale of those who, you know, the Mellons and the Leverhumes and all of these other foundations. And I think that we also, the message is not just to the parsimonious government, it's to the culture at large and those who have accrued value and somehow feel that that frees them from engagement in community. I think that this is the message we really need to go out very strongly with, that you know, facing all the challenges we do that your correspondent on the chat mentioned, we are going to need, it is a necessity that we start to give the due to the humanities for the creation of the visual world, for good or ill, that we live in, and our understanding of where value is really created. Because I think that, you know, this is not pie in the sky. I firmly believe that, you know, in comparison to, you know, the Facebooks and the Microsofts and the mining billions of Australia are as nothing compared to the trillions of what Apple has produced. So in other words, this is not round the edge of real work or round the edge of real industry. This is the industry.
Core.
This is the core of the next 50 years of wealth creation. And I think we have to argue vociferously that humanity, the depth of humanities scholarship, will not only help generate wealth, but temper our society's attitude to distributive justice, and help us emerge, I'm afraid to say, rather better in the next 50 years than we have in the last 50. And that's my optimistic hope.
Yes, and it's wonderful to end, I think, on a note of optimism in a year that has been largely depleted of that emotion. So I think we'll conclude that, and I will just ask Professor Will Christie to come and say a few concluding words.
I'll speak from up here, if I can. Thank you so much, Mark. Always inspiring. What I'm hearing as I listen to you, is that we are to some extent victims of our own sort of Kantian disinterestedness. And we've just got to get away from that initial and I think very influential construction of the aesthetic as somehow not to be muddied, not to be in any way sullied by its association with other aspects of society. And we've got to make a claim in that way. I think that's brilliant. I love your idea of initial humanities input assessment. I think we need to go away and think exactly about how our different disciplines and our different art forms relate, can be seen to have, or can be assessed in some ways. Of course, we accept the fact that it, to some extent what you're offering is deliberately provocative, that it does fly against our Kantian assumptions in a number of ways. Yet having said that, none of us wants to devalue what we do. And the whole concept, the word that used to puzzle me, I remember as a child, was this idea of priceless. Priceless, meaning a price couldn't be put on it, but also beyond all price in a way. And that's where we're sort of flirting with that notion of pricelessness, but trying to get a nuance into that. So thank you so much for that wonderful and inspiring speech, as always, Mark. I'm Will Christie, incidentally. I'm the director of the Australasian Consortium of Humanities Research Centres, the ACHRC that you see on your screen. The annual conference of the ACHRC starts tomorrow at 12 noon, with day 2 starting at the same time, 12 noon on Friday. And there's still time to book. My message to everybody who is listening to us this evening is that there's still plenty of time to book. Go to the libraries, the State Library of New South Wales webpage, and you'll see all the details under the events on the ACHRC Annual Conference website. I hope you can join us. It would be well worthwhile, and you have got a very strong intimation this evening from that wonderful public lecture. Thank you so much, Professor Mark Ledbury. Wonderful.